The Gulf that night was heavy with a heat that doesn't show up on thermometers, a thickness in the air that made even the stars seem reluctant. The Deepwater Horizon floated in that stillness, like a lit city block set down on black glass, her cranes slow and patient as praying mantises, her decks humming with engines and compressors and human habit, 50 miles off Louisiana, where the Mississippi's brown breath met the darker body of the sea. The rig was closing up a well they'd nicknamed Macondo. They'd been on it too long. It had argued back in whispers and in numbers and, lately, in the language of pressure. Below, far below in 5,000 feet of water and more than 2 miles of seafloor rock, a borehole ran into an ancient reservoir. The mud they'd pumped slick and heavy, engineered like a recipe had kept the column in equilibrium. Gravity against ghostly force. Now came the delicate work of replacing that mud with lighter seawater in preparation to leave the well sealed and ready for a future production platform. On paper, it was a routine. On paper, most things are. In the drill shack, where glass and gauges made a cockpit for those who drove the well like a machine, a driller in a sweat-darkened shirt kept one eye on the returns. The screens threw pale light on his face. The numbers sat like quiet beside him. The tool pusher played the role. Older men play for younger ones. The weight in the room that keeps rashness from becoming momentum. Over the radio, the mudlugger reported flow that didn't match expectation. Small thing, phrased as politeness, so no one would later say he'd made a scene. In another module, ABP, company man stared at a chart and read reassurance into uncooperative lines. They ran a negative pressure test. Bleeding pressure to see if the well held without pushing back. It was meant to be a question that could be answered. Does the well stand with 0 on the watch? Instead, the drill pipe gauge refused to read 0. It sat at more than 1,000 pounds, and then wandered. On the kill line, the numbers behaved like a child who knows when it's being watched. Men gathered around the anomaly and massaged it with theory. Someone offered bladder effect, a neat term that satisfied not because it convinced, but because it closed a door. The driller felt the floor thrumming under his boots and kept his hands busy because idle hands make thought too loud. Out on the main deck, a roustabout hauling a hose saw a shimmer in the spill pan the way diesel makes the air above it dance, and itched at the thought of gas you can TC finding its way into spaces that weren't built for it. The sea smelled like salt and something else. Sharp, bitter, chemical. A crane operator lit a cigarette, and then, remembering the signs that said not to, let it die in his palm while he watched a line of bright lights on the horizon fishing boats idling in the nighttime calm. They had cemented the casing days before a nitrogen-foamed recipe meant to set and keep set. The cementer had watched the slurry go down and felt a doubt he'd put privately in a text once and then smothered with work. The centralizers, those little shoes that keep pipe true in a hole so cement can fill evenly, had been installed. Fewer than the plan had asked. Compromises negotiated by men balancing risk the way tightrope walkers use their arms. The whale had accepted these shortcuts with silence. In oilfield work, silence like still water can mean depth or menace. Just before 9 p.m., the phone on the drill floor rang and a voice asked for patience, the way you ask for weather to change. The displacement was ahead of schedule. They would pick up faster. Mud pumped out to the sea, mixed with the real sea, and vanished into a night that had swallowed bigger scenes. On the rig, the fans blew air in simple faith through engine rooms where pistons moved like giant knuckles. Gas detectors hung in corners like small, thoughtful birds, their green lights patient. The first sign came in the returns with a hiccup. Then the flow rose for no reason that satisfied the math in the driller's head. He reached for the controls and began to close the annular, the rubbery donut that grips pipe and says to chaos, "Not here, not today." Tegriptuk. Then twitched. Mud rose in the bell nipple and spilled out in a dirty waterfall, an ugly trick of light under fluorescent. "Flow," someone said. One word to come, and then again, louder, so the word would make its way through stubborn disbelief. Gas and oil from a body of rock that pressurized before humans spoke in sentences were now in the wellbur like a whisper, becoming a shout, becoming a chorus. The driller hit the divert. The rig answered with a deep, structural groan that old hands know too well, vibration speaking through their teeth. Men who had learned to move slowly moved fast, without looking fast. The tool pusher put a green button under his thumb and made the call every tool pusher prays he never has to make. In the engine rooms, air moved the way it always moved, carrying the night mix through filters and across fins into the lungs of 4 big engines that powered the floating city. Somewhere, a sensor tasted methane. Somewhere else, another didn't. A pinkish mist lifted off the drill floor, a rain made of mud and gas, fine and electric, weather born of buried time. The lights flickered. On the bridge, a DPO dynamic positioning officer felt the rig slip half a meter to starboard and corrected without meaning to acknowledge he defelt it. He stared out at the dark ocean, standing unhelpfully beautiful. On the drill floor, men squinted against the stinging in their eyes. A Dedekman, high up in the monkey bore, looked down and thought of ladders, of every rung he'd ever held. Someone's radio carried a voice that failed to click to transmit and became a private confession. This ISNT right. The annular coughed, not closing cleanly enough, and the well answered that arrogance by spitting heavy drilling mud, straight up in a geyser that carried cuttings and old rock and a sheen of darker promise. It hit the overhead and came down as rain. The driller called for the blowout preventer, the great stack on the seabed, to do the thing it had been built to do, sure and seal, kill the well like a guillotine kills argument. He punched the sequence that told a set of hydraulics a mile away to obey, and 1,000 things had to be true for that obedience to happen. Not enough were the alarms began to warble, a noise like a drill pushing too hard on enamel. Red lights came alive. The air was now part fuel. Engines breathed more than they should and raced, hunting in the way machines do when they are fed wrong. Electrostatic hairs stood up on forearms. Shut it down. Someone yelled into a room already loud. Somewhere on the main deck, a man named Dewey saw his friend turn his head and start to say something ordinary, something about coffee, and then a blue-white flash hit the world like a thrown plate, followed by a noise that erased all other noises. Heat rushed in like an animal. The line that tethered every human decision to this spot pulled tight as if something vast below the sea had yanked it. For half a breath, there was no breath. A sheet of fire ran out low and then stood up. Steel, which always looks brave, warped in seconds, skin wrinkling and then sloughing off. The sound was everywhere. A deep-bellied roar that belonged to storms, not 2 man-made islands. A man staggered up from the deck, and couldn't he find his boots because his brain was being reorganized by noise. A door blew off its hinges and went out, and someone who had reached for it fell forward into absence instead. A hand hit an east. A Mao made a prayer that the mouth hadn't practiced. On the bridge, a voice cracked on a word meant to sound calm into the radio. Mayday. Mayday. Mayday, Deepwater Horizon fire on the rig. The sentence broke apart, like everything else. The sky over the Gulf went orange and malignant and showed itself in the black faces of the windows miles away onshore, where no one yet knew anything, and on the water, where men were about to jump and fall 20, 30, 40 feet into dart that tasted of salt and diesel and burned rubber. The ocean caught them badly, as oceans do at night. The heat behind their backs chased them into the cold. Lifeboats hung on davits. One line jammed uselessly as men wrestled with a weight that did not want to swing. On the lower deck, a coxswain slapped hands away from the release, counted in a voice he'd trained to be steel, and kicked. The skiff slapped into the sea and took water, then snapped back righted, full of bodies replying with animal gratitude. The rig was a tower of fire, 3 stories of flame, curled and uncurled like muscle. The derrick burned hollow. Diesel tanks thumped. The fire found steel and softened it, found paint and lifted it in flakes that fell like sick snow. Men ran in arc-lit corridors that looked like the inside of a kill. Some found their muster stations, some didn't. Smoke cut vision down to arm's length. Heat made air a decision. In the radio chaos, a bridge officer repeated latitude and longitude until the pattern felt like a charm. The bop on the seafloor, blind and deaf, except to signals, was asked again to cut. When the command ran down the dead umbilical of compromised hydraulics, it arrived like a suggestion, not a law. Coast Guard watchstanders took the call and launched. A helicopter's rotors bit night out of the sky and fed the noise into headsets, where pilots measured hope against fuel and headwinds. On the water, the Damon B. Bankston, a supply boat tied alongside, cast off and backed out into rain of fire. The deck of the supply boat was a war hospital in miniature. In a minute burned blankets, bottled water, men dripping and staring. A roustabout sat down hard and didn't stand again because standing requires a future. Somewhere inside the rig a hand hit the emergency disconnect system that should have told giant valves to close, risers to unlatch, intellect to triumph over momentum. In the crown of steel under 5,000 feet of water, the blind shear rams the brute jaws met drill pipe that had buckled under pressure and load and was no longer where the jaws wanted it. Solenoids that should have fired were starved. A battery that should have been full was not. The machine that had always been described as a failsafe was trying to do many improbable things at once, in an instant, when improbable wouldn't he do. You could see the glow from the shrimp docks in Venice, a smudge like a second sunset. Fishermen paused over coils of line and watched the horizon as if they had been expecting something to announce the new day like bells. The community has always read sky like scripture. Tonight it was reading a disaster sermon spoken in light. On board, time contracted. Grown men called for their fathers, and some called for their sons. A floor man who had made jokes all the way to 9 p.m. slid down a ladder, used his shoulder to leva a stuck hatch, and muted his emotions to pass a man 3 years his junior through it. Another took off his life jacket when he saw a crewmate without him, put it on the other, then picked up a ring buoy and made that his plan. In the mess, ceiling panels fell in lazy, burning pieces onto tables, still set with condiments. A refrigerator blew out of its niche and skated across tile, spewing white mist like breath. Mayday traffic wrestled with the airwaves. 33 souls, said an early call, and then more. And then we're missing 11. The number sat like a stone in the stomach. Somewhere, a list began to be written. A list of names that would one day be carved. Dewey Rivette, Jason Anderson, Aaron Dolliver, Donald Clark, Stephen Curtis, Gordon Jones, Roy Wyatt Kemp, Carl Kleppinger Jr., Blair Manuel, Shane Rock, Adam V's. The ones still aboard hunted for the missing in places that weren't places anymore, but shapes of heat. The sea surface boiled, oil and gas breathing out of the riser now full of things that wanted to be air. They came out of the mouth of the well like the exhalation of a buried animal. Flames licked the underside of the rig. The dynamic positioning thrusters, confused by lost inputs and a world rearranged, fought to keep a geometry that no longer mattered. Steel finally sagged in a way that made its intentions clear even to the busiest. At dawn on the second day, the whole structure tilted, steadied itself as if unwilling to admit the gesture, tilted again toward one corner, and then the balance went. She went down with a groan that radiated through the water and into bones. The derrick slid into the ocean, and a slurry of flame and foam took the space where the deck had been. 200 feet of riser connected to the seafloor went with her, bending and kinking, tearing but not disconnecting. The mouth of the well was now open to the gulf through metal, resembling a long straw, twisted by a clumsy hand. In the minutes and hours after, an ugly truth extended itself into daylight. A sheen spread, wide as counties. It caught morning light and played beauty falsely. Rainbows where there should be shrimp boats. The smell reached shore first, chemical and sick. A throat-occupying citrus metallic bite that told grandmothers to shut windows. Gulls circled and then avoided a patch of sea they'd known to be generous yesterday. Helicopters ran grids, their shadows scalloping the slick. At first, officials said 1,000 barrels a day. It was an estimate colored by hope and by the human hunger to use small numbers when large ones terrified. Within days, as remotely operated vehicles swam down through cold black water to the kneeling wreckage and lit up, in grainy clarity, the torn end of the riser and a pair of vents blowing like ruptured lung. The number revised itself. 5,000. Then more. Scientists on shore argued with press officers about the difference between volume and anger. The camera images beamed into living rooms, oil unrolling like silk, taught watchers how to see flow. On the docks of Barataria Bay, a man who had always measured his year in seasons of shrimp and oysters took his cap off for a full minute and used both hands to comb nothing in particular. He remembered oil from other spills as smears on hulls, stripes you could point at and curse. He stood in a thin morning light, and watched the water itself darken, a spread like a stain in fabric. He called his brother, who was on another boat, and said nothing until his brother said hello a second time. Rumor ran faster than oil on shore. Lines formed at bait shops, not for bait, but for information. A Coast Guard commander put down a coffee he'd been carrying to another meeting and walked to a window. In conference rooms, full of maps and plastic sheeting, men and women with epaulets and lanyards began to draw circles with dry erase markers that tried to predict. A thing that does not like to be predicted when edge slick currents. The shape of history. Someone said boom and someone else said we have boom but we have less boom than we wish. Someone else said the word dispersant and it hung there for a beat. A chemical answer to a geologic problem. At sea, the rig site burned without a rig. The supply boat that had been a lifeboat ferried survivors ashore. On the bank of a canal lined with reeds, a mother hugged a man who smelled like burned laundry and salt. Her ear pressed to his chest as if it were a radio that might compress into one sentence what had happened out there. He did not have the sentence yet. A reporter came too close and then backed away. Not by manners, but because grief is a heat that repels before it invites. In the depth of the Gulf, 5,000 feet down, the blowout preventer stood black and indifferent, wires hanging like the hems of a damaged dress. Row of arms reached toward it with the careful, clumsy grace of beaks. They tried valves that had been frozen open by fate. Tried caps on holes meant to be permanent. Onshore, an engineer watched the video feed in a room too bright and felt his stomach go hollow. He could see the problem. He could see 100 answers that would have worked yesterday. He could not reach back through time. The slick spread. Pelicans, brown and handsome in their ugly way, dozed in relative safety for another day on pilings that would soon sheen. Turtles surfaced and took a breath that tasted wrong. The math grew darker by the hour. The Coast Guard and BP shook hands in press briefings and called themselves unified. Offshore, men in Tyvek suits and gloves would soon be laying orange boom into the wind like strings on a giant instrument, hoping that line and fabric could fence the sea. The sheen caught up to them like an idea that cannot be outrun. In an aircraft flying a pattern that made a crosshatch of sky, a biologist pressed her forehead to plastic and tried to decide which way to turn first. The wound at the bottom of the ocean kept on exhaling, and the human habit of naming failed to make it smaller. They called the largest leak site the end of the riser, the second the kink, the third the broken drill pipe. In the rove feed, each was a mouth without a face. Engineers asked themselves a new kind of what if. What if you could lower a steel box on old idea on a new scale over the biggest mouth and let physics do mercy? The cofferdam left port. Like a chapeau, on deck it was cathedral large. All angles and openings, wider than a living room, tall as a standing whale. Cameras gathered as if for a launch. On shore, people prayed with eyes open. When the dome met cold water and drifted down through blue to green to black, the idea stayed good until it touched the leak. Gas, seeking to quit its liquid prison, did what gas does in water that cold. And pressure, that absolute. It became ice, a mechanical frost, with tricks of geology baked into its crystal. The box, filled with hydrates, a frothy snow that clogged where flow was meant to funnel. ROVs knocked at it with little fists. It shrugged them off with chemistry. The structure rose again, heavy with proof of a lesson the sea had taught before two men who had done tea had to listen. In the weeks that followed, the ocean turned into a work site the size of a small country. Skimmers made passes that looked like mowing. Planes flew low and let fall long curtains of Corexit's dispersant. A word new to many tongues. This time, for the first time, they also pushed it into the spill where it began. A mile down, hoses snaked into the dark, spraying where human eyes could not make judgments based on color. Scientists wrote their names on letters that said caution while responders answered, with tired kindness, that the arithmetic of harm was being done at a scale incomprehensible enough that imperfect answers might be all that were left. On brittle marsh at the edge of Barataria, oil licked the salt. It did not. Coat, it entered, a slow murder. A man in boots stepped off a small flatboat and sank 3 inches into an oil-water mix that made a sound like pudding kissed by a spoon. He stood still and watched a periwinkle snail try to decide what to do about a life that had changed without warning. Brown pelicans came ashore to nest, beaks full of fish that tasted of a past now flavored with benzene. A wildlife rehabber in a white suit lifted a heavy bird from a net and said over and over, "I've got you," until the words meant something to both of them. The bird stared with ancient calm. A camera clicked. Out of frame, a teenager in borrowed gloves held a hose that put warm, soapy water into feathers, evolved to repel seawater, not to drink a refinery. On narrow roads shaded by live oaks, trucks with unfamiliar logos out-of-state contractors, someone's cousin, volunteers, veterans of other storms rumbled. Toward staging areas where pallets of boom sat like medical supplies, locals signed up for vessels of opportunity and turned boats that had learned shrimp into boats that learned oil. They took GPS coordinates from men in polos and followed them into white-capped days. And when the wind blew south, they tied the end of the boom to a willow and said words. The willow didn't he need to understand. In a lab at LSU, a graduate student ran a spectrometer across a sample and found the signature of polynuclear aromatics. In Port Fortune, a man filled out a form for the second time because the first time nothing happened. In a congressional hearing room in Washington, a row of executives in ties measured their sentences into microphones under the gaze of marble and anger. Who is to blame? Came in variations. The answers slid and stuck in a way that satisfied no one. Outside, a woman held a sign that said simply, 11. At the well site, engineering changed its tense from past to future with ferocity. The top hat, a small cap like a knitted beanie for a steel throat, descended in a ballet of cranes and wires. It, too, caught hydrates. They heated lines, built flutes to coax gas to rise where they wanted it to rise. A riser insertion tube gave relief for a moment, capturing a portion of the flow and piping it into a ship to be flared, a ghastly candle at sea. Under the water, the main gush continued, taunting out of the flood. Then they announced top kill. It was an old oil field maneuver, the industrial equivalent of putting your palm over a mouth and breathing calm back into it. From the surface ships, they would pump drilling mud down into the boat, at a rate and pressure so astonishing that it would push back the well's own fury, arresting upward motion, making it remember gravity and compliance. Onshore, in living rooms full of news, hope rose like a fever. In command rooms, charts came off printers in an endless scroll, colored for flow. The pump's heart beat, mud left tanks, and went down hoses, and went down into the dark. The ROV cameras caught a moment where the down-blown mud appeared like brown weather in a white storm backscatter. Maybe victory. On the deck of a boat, a Cajun captain watched the sky and tried to will it quiet. On a motel bed, a woman older than her age lay on her side to rest, one lung that had been stung by vapors day after day, her phone face down on the blanket because if it rang she wanted naps not to sound panicked. Pilot slept 30 minutes in a chair with his headset still around his neck because anything longer felt like hubris. An engineer in a trailer ran a simulation for the 20th time and put his hands on his face when the model gave him the same failure in the same place. On a barrier island, a kid stuck his fingers in tar like it was the world's worst candy and looked around to see if his father would say no. The pumps thudded. The wells of the pumps ran dry. They refilled them. They added shredded tires and golf balls and fibrous, pill-to-junk shot plugs for an artery too wide. The ROV cameras watched a fountain refuse to lower its voice. Pressure readings snaked up and down a point no one wanted them to cross. The room where decisions were made grew quiet. In a trailer, far enough out on a port that pelicans have the right of way, Someone leaned back and looked at the ceiling to keep the sting out of his eyes. He had been promising, for days, that this would work. He closed his mouth. The pumps wound down. The mud that had been meant to hold came back up as insult. Topkill had not killed. On a pier, a fisherman closed his knife and put it back into a pocket already ruined by oil. Araha dipped a brush into warm foam and went back to the work of saving one pelican at a time. Offshore, the ROVs turned their lights on the blown-out end of the riser and saw the ocean still coughing black, relentless as a heart. And the narrative tilted towards something like an ending without yet letting you have it. They cut the torn riser to make a clean lip for a new cap to land on. The giant shears they brought down were like a prop from an exaggerated play, orange and slow and terrifying. The saw they tried first jammed in the mangled pipe, the teeth biting and then popping free into a space suddenly full of impatience. The shears took longer than they wanted, and everyone braced for additional flow when the last metal ligament let go. When it did, the plume doubled its exuberance for a breath, and then a lower marine riser package cap was lowered into that manic garden of pressure. It caught some portion. Numbers scrolled in daily briefings. 11,000 barrels a day on Tuesday, 15 on Friday. It was like catching rain in teacups. The well continued to talk in its loudest voice beneath the teacups. A cap designed later, more robust. A capping stack that would bring 3 rams to bear, lifted by cranes that creaked in sympathetic anxiety, descended toward a target drawn by GPS and hand-sketched prayer. Onshore, anger turned articulate. A CEO on camera said he wanted his life back, and found he had defined his role in the story by accident. In the halls of Congress, photographs of oiled pelicans were held up next to photographs of the rig burning. A woman from Grand Isle spoke into a microphone in a room that smelled faintly of wood polish and air conditioning and made a sound that made those present duck their heads. Not words, exactly, but something ancient. Meanwhile, checks were cut and deposited and denied and reissued. A $20 billion fund was announced from behind a podium. Lawyers found new clothes and put them on. Hurricane season arrived on schedule like a long-forgotten appointment coming due. Alex spun in the Caribbean, shouldered off from the Gulf by a luck, not earned, but accepted. Skimming operations stood down when waves topped 4 feet. Dispersant application halted, then resumed, then halted again in a rhythm that felt like someone breathing poorly. Workboats got heavier with heat. Men on deck put bandanas under ball caps to keep necks from boiling. Heat lightning walked the horizon like a restless animal at night. Scientists launched cruises in research vessels with names unknown outside their circles. They found a veil of suspended microdroplets. A milky galaxy hanging between surface and seabed. A plume not of fire, but of chemistry. At 900 meters, fragile corals dimmed, their delicate trees turning muddy where they contacted snow that fell without a weather report. On a barge, a man who had never read a peer-reviewed paper and never would dragged one boom length into a U around a pocket of oil and felt proud. And he was right to feel so. On the anniversary of other things that never should have happened, they tried again. The capping stack, built fast and hard, descended like a gallows lowered onto a neck. ROVs swarmed it like Ramirez, their cameras domesticating a titanic carapace. Commands went down, wires like thoughts. Valves cracked and then what turned. Hand wheels that have never been touched by human hands spinning in frames. Someone in a trailer full of displays held a breath without noticing until later. The first of the 3 rams closed, then the second, then the third. Each one a different geometry of closure. The ocean didn't like it. Flow hit restrictions and shrugged. Tenet sloped. Then it became not a fountain, but a leak. A thermometer somewhere clicked down minutely with the change in convective violence. The chatter on the coms went tight and spare. On the deck of a shrimp boat, intentionally rented by the responsible party because every hull that floated was now part of a calculus, nobody had planned a little boy, pointed at the horizon where no new smoke rose for the first time in so long that you could measure the quiet. His father rubbed the boy's head and looked away. Because looking can be a superstition. On a marsh edge that had just been flushed with clean water by a tide that was not in a hurry, a fiddler crab came out of a hole with one grossly oversized claw and waved it at nothing. Somewhere there were dolphins rolling in water that was half clean and half memory. On a beach, men in respirators used shovels on a substance that the heat had turned into something like asphalt. The capping test would take time. The pressure would be watched to see if the well would push back through the earth itself, finding some weakness miles down. Engineers who wore their worry like a suit would sleep in 2-hour shifts if they slept at all. They were so close to the edge of the sound that would mean the ocean was not being fed something it did not ask for. They could feel the weight of days ahead. Relief well, static kill, bottom kill, phrases that had become a lexicon for the faithful. A drill bit miles away was already nosing toward a target the way a hound finds a burrow, inch by cautious inch. Its operators whispering to magnetic fields and geology. In a hangar, a pile of Tyvek suits leaned unfussed to one side like unoccupied ghosts. In a courtroom, 2 men in suits spoke softly to each other about how to say sorry without saying more than that. In a rehab tent that smelled of bleach and fish, a woman blew gently across a pelican's breastbone to dry its down because the blowers frightened it. On the screens in control rooms, gauges numbers did not go where the nightmare editions of the plan said they might. A valve that had not held 3 weeks ago now held. The ocean at the leak site went from frantic to disturbed. It was a difference people who had watched too many hours of it could feel in their bones. Then someone said it out loud. "Shut," he said. It wasn't shouted. It was recorded on a legal pad by a man who would keep the pad forever. The machinery above the well tightened itself against itself. The plume that had defined a season began to thin, then fray, then become mist. A watching world leaned in, collective breath held, as screens showed a blackness becoming gray, then nothing at all but water, disturbed by the memory of what had been. Onshore, phones lit up, and fingers hovered over a send button with a message that was both monument and question, and the ocean calmed over a wound that, for the first time in 87 days, was not actively bleeding. The capping stack held. Pressure built the way you hope it will in a sealed jar, in a small room where sleep had been ephemeral. Someone wept without asking permission from the body that had carried him through these weeks. The word stopped went out, then was corrected to sealed pending tests, then accepted by a public too tired for semantic caution. The Gulf exhaled, and for a day the wind moved over it without picking up a taste. But an ending needed more than silence at a hole. On Agustres Day, pumped heavy mud down from the top in what lasted a few hours and was called, with mechanics poetry, the static kill. Gravity and density did work, that explosions cannot. A day later, cement followed the mud, hardening like vows. The relief well, a slow prayer that had been descending all this time with infuriating care, turned a few more degrees, then a few more, chasing a target the size of a sandwich to miles below seabed. On September 15th, it touched the annulus of the original well, the last place the well might be speaking. On September 19th, with pumping in pressure evidence like testimony, the federal government declared Macondo effectively, finally, dead. The dead do not always stay quiet. These. Up top, the water was not clean just because it was no longer being made dirty. Tens of thousands of men and women worked spoons and scoops against tar that came ashore in beetle-hard patties, and in glossy stains that adhered to the skin like a bad idea. Cleanup boats dragged skimmers behind them like little sleds, seeing a faint line of brown in the V and turning toward it like predators who had learned to eat a new prey. Boom! Dragged and bent and ragged, still caught oil, but also caught pelicans' feet, turtles, patience, and sometimes fire. Night burning continued for a time. Circles of oil ignited in a ring and left to make their own weather. Columns of black smoke going up so straight in still air that it hurt the eye. The 11 who didn't come home lived in photographs on mantels, now their faces becoming iconic in the way faces do when memory is demanded by public grief. In Mississippi, a mother slid her thumb down a frame and set his name to a room that did not mind the repetition. In Louisiana, a supervisor stood in a warehouse and explained to a class of 20 that this part of the course alarm interpretation was not optional. In Texas, a son put on a hat his father had always sweated through and went to work less fearless than before. The funerals had come and gone under tents that flapped in coastal wind. Bagpipes. Flag folding. Men in hard hats who didn't know what to do with their hands except hold one another up at shoulders and back. In the courts and committees where policy remembers to wake up once damage is tall enough to climb onto, the old alphabet changed. MMS, the scandal-worn Minerals Management Service, gave way to BOMRA, then to BOM and B. EE, acronyms, scrubbed and shuffled like chairs after an argument. Blowout preventers were rethought with a vengeance. 2 shear rams became a baseline. Deadman systems got redundancy. Cement testing was codified. Negative pressure tests, no longer objects for private interpretation. In the oil field, drills turned again. Drilling moratoriums lifted, then were replaced with slower, more complicated review. Containment systems were built in staged modular caps waiting in quiet warehouses to be shipped on red alert like fire engines with salt on their undercarriages. Science wrote slowly, then quickly. Papers described a deep plume and the microbes that bloomed within it to feast on hydrocarbons. Little mouths made of cellular appetite, lowering oxygen levels to near frightening, but not catastrophic. Oceanic breath, hitching, and then smoothing. Long-lived dolphins in Barataria carried scars and illnesses years later. Calves lost at rates that kept biologists up, their spines and C-shapes over data. Marsh edges retreated faster where oil had killed roots. Slabs of land sliding off into channels that had already been losing ground to water before humans forced them to gamble with more. Red snapper in the Gulf tasted as they always had to those who grilled them later with lemon and butter. But under scales, there were stories in ice. The Gulf is big and resilient and wounded. These facts sat together. A man in Grand Isle opened his seafood shack again with a little ceremony. A ribbon cut with shears. The tourists, fewer first, and then more, came back with ice chests and hats, inappropriate for this sun. He stood at his counter and smiled with his eyes, and used sanitizer between customers and stuffed po. Boys with fried oysters that had been tested in labs before they were tested on tongues. At a rehab center, the last pelican from the last wave of oilings fought the carrier with offensive optimism, beak clacking like a complaint, and was ferried back to the very place where the water had betrayed it. Because home and danger lived too near one another here. BP pleaded guilty to felony manslaughter eventually, and paid fines measured correctly only by the number of zeros. A ledger both a punishment and a political argument settled with money. A compensation fund cut 400,000 checks and missed others. And fraud existed, and real need existed. And both wore boots sometimes, and sometimes suits. A paralegal sitting at a desk at midnight read letters that made him bite his lip and wrote responses that had to balance empathy with guardrails written by people he would never meet. And in a museum on Poydras Street, a lighted display showed the drill bit and the core and the BOP model and the photographs. You can never unsee of the rig burning like a sun where there should be no suns. A ranger in a green shirt talked about barrier islands with the patience of a tree. A child pressed a hand against glass where a map of currents crept and eddied, and followed a blue line with a fat finger, saying the names like spells: Chandelure, Breton, Plaquemines. Years later, a storm spun the wrong way over the warmest water and lifted tar that had sat quiet a while and laid it back down on a beach where it read as fresh and made a morning-s news. Memory in a place like this is never linear. Men who were there on the night of April 20th wake sometimes at a smell that others call normal and listen harder than they need to the hum of their household machines. Women who watched bird after bird after bird find feathers in the lint trap and think absurdly. Not of the goose down in a coat, but of pelicans they can recognize in photographs now as individuals by the pattern of their faces. The Gulf moves dolphins and freighters and shrimp through itself like a throat that doesn't have time to be sentimental, and yet somehow is. The ocean that was coated in black was also, and remains, blue and green and brown and complicated. It gives and takes, and people along it have learned to live with both the giving and the taking. The whale was finally killed, and something else was awakened that may go back to sleep and may not. A respect that tastes like fear, a sense of scale, an understanding that the century we live in will hold in itself more of these arguments between human ambition and the old. Implacable physics that lie below 5,000 feet of water and 2 miles of rock, under fluorescent lights. In classrooms, the blowout is now a case study. At the cemeteries, grass grows up around names. At dawn on the Gulf, nets still go out. Through a skin of water so thin it seems unbelievable that human choice could change it. And yet, if stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that change the world.